All right, well, welcome back. We're working through Exodus 3:14 and those two phrases of I am who I am and I am. And so far we've seen how those statements unveil God's transcendence, that was the first core thing. And the second core thing that these two statements unveil is this, that God's relational. Whenever you first meet somebody, chances are you'll ask them, hey, what's your name? And it's hard to have a relationship with a person when you don't know their name. Names, they connect us together. And in Exodus 3:14, God has revealed that he has a name. In other words, he's knowable, he's relational, that he's revealed himself to humanity in order to be known, and in order to enter into a relationship with his people. And if Moses is to ever be the leader of Israel, if he's ever to be refined into the kind of person to spearhead Israel's exodus from Egypt, this is what he needs to learn. That he needs to learn the height of God as the transcendent one, because God is, I am who I am, and God does hold all the power to even decimate and to lay waste to the world's first superpower, Egypt. But he also needs to learn that God's relational, that God hears and sees and knows, and has even brought Moses close to him and will soon bring the whole nation close to him. God's not cold. He's not distant. He loves this nation. And even later in Exodus 4:22, Yahweh will say this, Israel is my son, my firstborn. In other words, the same kind of love that a father has for a son, a love that's unconditional, that goes all the way, a love that's deep and beautiful and rich and sacrificial, a love that will always last. That's the kind of love that God has for this people, because he is, I am. Exodus 3:14, and maybe put it this way, this is the thesis statement of Exodus. And the rest of the book of Exodus, it expands upon those 2 points. Exodus will show you the breadth of God as transcendent, but also the depth of God as relational, that Yahweh truly is, I am. And if you're wondering, okay, but this is a series about pursuing Christ, so why are we spending so much time on Exodus 3:14? How does this inform my pursuit of Christ as a Christian? The answer lies in John 8:58. And so turn there to John 8:58. And while you're doing so, the Gospel of John is unique in that it simultaneously walks you through the Old Testament, but also the life of Christ in such a way to teach you that Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. And if you're like, I don't get that, help me understand that. For example, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We've heard that phrase, in the beginning, before in Genesis 1:1. And John's like, I want to talk about Jesus, which actually means I would need to talk about Genesis 1, or even John 1:14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word for dwelt is actually to tabernacle. The tabernacle in Exodus was the demonstration visibly that God dwells with his people, that God and man have actually come together. And John says that Jesus tabernacled among us. He's saying that man, once again, and God have come together. Why? Because Jesus is God, and he now dwells with his people. In that same verse even, John even describes Jesus as being full of grace and truth. That's a quotation from Exodus 34, verse 6. Whenever the nation became idolaters and they're worshiping a golden calf, Yahweh appeared to Moses and proclaimed that Yahweh is full of grace and truth, that Yahweh pours out his kindness upon a wicked and upon an undeserving people. And now that same language was attached to Jesus in John 1:14. Why? Because Jesus pours out his kindness upon a wicked and undeserving people. Why? Because that's what God has always done. And Jesus is God, Yahweh, the God of the Exodus. And you might say, okay, but are you sure that Jesus is Yahweh, the God of Exodus? Yeah, and let me begin to show you this. In Exodus, the sea is split, and then God feeds people with bread from heaven. And then in John 6, Jesus walks on water and then feeds his people with bread. Jesus is like, you thought splitting water was cool? Watch me walk on it and then feed everyone. Jesus is Yahweh, the God of Exodus. And as we come to John 8, Jesus is squaring off against some of the Jews, and they're accusing him of crazy stuff here, like having a demon, and they just keep pushing Jesus. They're like, Jesus, you could never be greater than Abraham. You could never be greater than the prophets. And here's the verse. Here's how Jesus responds. John 8:58. Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. Same language, same phrase as Exodus 3:14 of I am. Jesus is quoting Exodus 3:14, and his declaration is the same. I'm the transcendent one. I'm the relational one. I'm Yahweh, the one who holds all the power, who's above and beyond, but also the one who loves and who brings his people close. That's me because I am God. And by the way, the Jews understood exactly what Jesus was saying, which is why in verse 59, they pick up stones to kill Jesus because Leviticus 24, verse 16, the punishment of blasphemy is death by stoning. They're saying it's blasphemy that God could ever be a man. But from Exodus 3:14 to John 8:58, we know that the same God who was with Moses and Israel in Egypt is the same God that's with us because we have Jesus, who is the I am. And he delivered Israel from physical slavery, and he delivered us from spiritual slavery. That's the one who we pursue now, the one of old who saves his people, even us, the I am who I am.